don't see you.
This is a review video I've wanted to do for quite some time, but the format's going to stay the same, but that's what took so long because this isn't going to be your typical review. Normally we do books. Uh, I've referenced articles and whatnot, but this is the first time that we're going to be reviewing another YouTube channel. Now, just for some background, the creator of that channel, um, I I don't want to say met him, but I'm acquainted with him through his Star Wars work, Star Wars fanatic, and it really, really was consumed by the deep dives that he did with the characters, the lore, the settings, everything within the Star Wars universe. But then kind of find out that he has a passion for telling supernatural and paranormal horror stories, and had set up and was creating these amazing videos to tell his stories. So that's what we're in store for today. And I said a little bit different because generally we're covering books. Now, it took me a while to put this together only because I wasn't sure how to format it, only to come to the realization that there is no difference. So sit back, enjoy, um, and definitely give them a look. Check out the channel in question is Twilight of Horror, and I'll have all the links for everything uh, in the post description and probably on the screen here too. So with that, let's get started. Welcome in or welcome back to the Veiled Archive. We are conditioned by the algorithm to view a YouTube channel as a fragmented collection of content, a scattered series of uploads designed for fleeting consumption. We expect the episodic. We expect the disconnected. But what happens when a creator does not build a channel, but instead constructs a unified architectural blueprint of dread? Today we are opening the ledger to examine a digital anomaly. It is a channel known as Twilight of Horror. This is not a repository of gathered creepypastas or stolen internet lore. It is a closed-loop ecosystem of terror. The creator is a solitary architect. He writes the manuscripts, he provides the clinical spoken word narration, he scores the ambient soundscapes, and he generates the visual assets that trap the viewer in his specific frequency. Twilight of Horror operates on a terrifying thesis that our reality is inherently fragile, and the laws governing our safety are subject to sudden mechanical failure. When you enter this archive, you are not listening to stories about survival. You are observing autopsies of the human condition. The narratives here map a geography of existential entrapment, where it is a haunted Appalachian forest, where a towering giant of absence mimics human hunting patterns, or a shape shifting house that subtracts the physical dimensions of its occupants. The focus is never on the monster's teeth. The focus is on the protagonist's realization that they have been written out of the safety equation. The creator understands that true fear requires a sanctuary violation. He takes the mundane, a quiet drive home, an old cemetery, a camping trip, and introduces a mathematical or biological subtraction. The shadows detach from their hosts. The memories of a loved one are revealed to be a karmic trap. The horror is systemic. We are not watching heroes conquer the dark. We are watching guilty witnesses and trapped psyches endure the symmetrical debt of their own existence. It asks a deeply uncomfortable question. What if the ghost is not an intruder, but a permanent resident of a reality we simply misunderstood? The primary deviation of Twilight of Horror lies in its complete rejection of the curator model. If you look at the modern landscape of the internet's horror hegemony, the vast majority of channels operate as aggregators. They collect stories from Reddit or independent submissions, read them over stolen ambient tracks, and slap on a piece of stock art. It is just a disjointed assembly line. Twilight of Horror operates on a completely different frequency. The creator acts as the sole architect of the entire structural integrity. He writes the manuscripts, he performs the narration, he scores the audio, he generates the specific AI visual assets. What this creates is a closed loop ecosystem. When you hit play, you are not just hearing a story, you are stepping into a singular, unified mind where the narrative mechanics are tightly synchronized with the sensory input. It is a masterclass in atmospheric control. Furthermore, this channel deviates sharply in its narrative structure. It rejects the survival blueprint entirely. We are used to characters who function as survivors, individuals who utilize their environment to prolong their existence, fight the monster, and escape the burning stage. Twilight of Horror does not care about the adrenaline of the harrowing escape. Instead, it utilizes what we in the archive call systemic entrapment. The horror isn't that something alien has arrived, it's that the rules of reality were always rigged against you, and you are only now just realizing it. Consider the clinical deviation present in stories like the haunted Appalachian Trail or the shifting geometry of the old house. The terror doesn't come from a loud jump scare. It comes from a quiet realization. It attacks the part of the human brain that relies on perspective and physical laws to navigate reality. The creator trusts his audience to sit with the discomfort of being intellectually outmatched by the universe. In standard horror, the protagonist is the victim or the hero. Here, the protagonists function as guilty witnesses. Their torture is not just the threat of death, it is the clarity of their knowledge. Their minds become the trap because they are forced to understand exactly why their reality is being subtracted or why their symmetrical debt is being collected. That heavy intellectual weight, the horror of the fully understood, is what sets this channel apart from the loud, kinetic noise of the modern horror landscape. The architect behind Twilight of Horror presents a fascinating dichotomy. In the archive, we frequently document creators who rely on a network of voice actors, ghostwriters, and stock audio. This creator, however, operates as a solitary engine. He writes the manuscripts, he provides the clinical narration, he scores the audio, and he generates the specific visual assets. He does not outsource his dread. He is the sole proprietor of his nightmare ecosystem. But to understand his specific frequency of fear, we must look at his origin point. He did not begin by mapping the abyss. He began by mapping a galaxy. The creator established his footprint under a completely different moniker, Star Wars fanatic. As a lifelong fan who studied writing in college, he built a platform dedicated to the deep dive analysis of the Star Wars universe, dissecting characters, lore, lighting, and musical cues with microscopic precision. This is the biographical paradox. He spends his days mapping the hero's journey, a cosmic structure built on balance, redemption, and luminous energy. Then he pivots to the Twilight of Horror, constructing an alternate universe where balance is a punitive mathematical equation and the hero is systemically erased. However, from the fan's perspective, these two channels are not disconnected. The rigorous world building required to analyze the lore of a massive sci fi franchise translates directly into the structural integrity of his horror. He approaches fear with the exact same clinical, analytical lens because he understands narrative mechanics so deeply. He knows precisely which foundational supports to knock out to make his protagonist's reality collapse. He treats his hauntings not as random, chaotic jump scares, but as meticulously designed ecosystem. This dual identity places him in a rare potent category. He is an architect who knows exactly how to build a universe of hope, which means he knows exactly the math required to unmake it. When we place Twilight of Horror within the broader context of the archive, we are not looking for simple thematic overlaps. We are searching for works that share its specific terrifying frequency. To understand where this channel fits in the hegemony of horror, we must anchor it to two distinct literary works and two cinematic counterparts that deal with the same algorithmic illusions and systemic entrapments. First, in the literary realm, we must examine Ambrose Bierce's classic An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. On the surface, Bierce's story of a Civil War hanging feels removed from supernatural entities, but the structural link is profound. Both works utilize the experimental psyche as the ultimate trap. In Twilight of Horrors, he forgot his own reality. A drunk driver experiences an elaborate, hallucinated reality where his deceased family is still alive. only to have the illusion brutally subtracted to reveal his culpability. This is the exact narrative mechanic Beers pioneered. The mind constructing a desperate, confronting fiction to delay the inevitable consequence. Both authors use the protagonist's own consciousness as the cage, pro- proving that the most terrifying space is the space between perception and reality. Second, we anchor this to Stephen King's short story 1408. This is where the invasive breach comes into play. King terrified us not with a traditional ghost, but with a hotel room that weaponized physics and time against its occupant. It attacked the fundamental trust in sanctuary. Twilight of Horror scales this localized dread perfectly in Ghosts Wouldn't Enter My House. The creator gives us an architecture that actively digests the protagonist's sanity, where a close closet door opening or a light switching off is not just a haunting, but a mechanical failure of safety. Both works demand that you sit with the suffocating realization that the environment itself is hostile and calculating. Moving to the cinematic ledger, the most immediate comparison is Mike Flanagan's Oculus. Oculus centers entirely on the gaslighting of its protagonists by a sentient mirror that distorts memory, time, and physical sensation. It shares the precise algorithmic illusion that permeates the Twilight of Horror catalog. In the channel's stories, characters frequently find themselves walking down roads that stretch infinitely, or speaking to people who aren't there, completely unable to trust their own senses. The way the siblings in Oculus try to fail to use technology and logic to outsmart the entity perfectly mirrors the intellectual dread found in the channel's narratives. The horrifying realization that your reality is being actively rewritten by something smarter than you. Finally, for the symmetrical debt, we look to the foundational architecture of the Twilight Zone, specifically episodes dealing with karmic loops like Judgment Night. Twilight of Horror excels at this specific culpability blueprint. In the channel's Old West Nightmare, a cowboy is hunted across the plains not by a random beast, but by the personification of death collecting a debt for a family the cowboy murdered. Both the Twilight Zone and this channel suggest that the universe is not indifferent. It is a reactive mechanism. It is a mirror reflecting our own arrogance or sin back at us, proving that for every action of hubris or cruelty, there is an equal and opposite reaction of horror. In the archive, we categorize these works not just as fiction, but as case studies in vulnerability. They all suggest that our reality is a fragile equation that can be easily unbalanced. Twilight of Horror sits securely at the center of these coordinates, drawing the existential manipulation of Bierce, the architectural hostility of King, and the karmic inevitability of the Twilight Zone into a single cohesive autopsy of the human mind. In this deep dive, we subject the Twilight of Horror catalog to a rigorous audit of its narrative architecture. This channel does not merely tell ghost stories, it constructs a unified engine supported by three distinct pillars. By dismantling these pillars, we can see exactly how this creator manipulates the traditional framework of fear into something far more intimate, ensuring that his specific brand of clinical dread reaches a listener with maximum efficiency. We use these pillars to calculate the Lovecraft metric, which in this case firmly returns a result of algorithmic illusion. Pillar A, the invasive breach, sanctuary violation. In traditional horror, sanctuary is a physical location, a locked door, a fortified camp, a childhood bedroom. In this archive, the sanctuary being violated is the reliability of the physical laws governing our reality. The breach is absolute. Consider the story of the shape-shifting house in the woods. The violation here is mechanical. When the moonbeams become lethal tripwires and the architecture of the house actively funnels its victims toward their demise, it isn't just a haunting, it is a metaphysically wrong space, colonizing the dimension. This is the mechanical failure of safety. How do you seek shelter when the environment itself is a hostile variable? The dread of Pillar A comes from the realization that the very ground beneath our feet is a fragile calculation that has been compromised. Pillar B, the symmetrical debt. reciprocity. Horror is often a closed loop of consequence, and Twilight of Horror operates on a devastating culpability blueprint. This is Pillar B in its purest form. In cosmic horror, we are usually victims of a random, uncaring universe. Here, we are the debtors. Look at the narrative mechanics of the cowboy, Kalen pursued across the plains. The towering dark entity following him is not a random monster. It is death itself, collecting the debt for the family Kalen murdered. The universe in this channel is not indifferent. It is highly reactive and perfectly balanced. The tragedy of the drunk driver trapped in a hallucination of his deceased family functions on the same frequency. The horror isn't the ghost, it is the symmetrical debt being collected. It is a mirror reflecting our own hubris back at us, showing us that for every sin there is a symmetrical, inescapable correction. And Pillar C is the experimental psyche, or the condition. The third structural pillar focuses on the trap of the mind. In this catalog, the protagonist's biology and intellect form the ultimate cage. Take the story of the grieving father utilizing out of body meditation, only to find himself trapped in a colorless, vibrating void of despair. His own grief and consciousness create the landscape of his entrapment. He is not locked in a physical room. His psyche is the experimental cell under observation. The horror here is existential entrapment. The mind's desperate attempts to rationalize its environment become the very mechanism that destroys it. The creator uses this pillar to suggest that our consciousness is not a gift, but a design flaw that allows us to fully comprehend our own unmaking. Through the synthesis of these three pillars, we arrive at the true Lovecraft metric of the channel. It utilizes algorithmic illusion to prove that we aren't just prey being hunted in the dark, we are variables in a system that is actively balancing itself. The channel is a masterclass in structural integrity because it shows us the blueprints of our own doom and forces us to admit that we earned our place within. When we analyze the reception of Twilight of Horror, we find a comment section that is deeply polarized, which in the archive is the primary indicator of a true structural anomaly. This channel does not attempt to appease the algorithm or the general consumer. It demands a specific type of intellectual participation that not every viewer is conditioned to provide. To understand the true impact of this work, we must look at the tension in the comments between the detractors and the advocates. On one side of the ledger, we have the detractors. These are the viewers trained by the modern, kinetic pacing of YouTube Shorts and TikTok, the disaster tourists. They approach horror expecting a jump scare within the first 60 seconds. For this group, Twilight of Horror is frequently a source of frustration. The comments from this camp often complain about the pacing, calling the videos too slow or the concepts too confusing. Because the creator writes with clinical detachment and focuses on the slow decay of reality, rather than a monster jumping out of a closet, the narrative can feel unyielding to those who prefer fast-paced, high-adrenaline survival horror. These reviewers often find the channel disorienting, not in the intended way of the architectural horror, but simply because it lacks traditional narrative handholding. They point to the absence of a victorious hero as a failure of the story, when a narrative ends with a protagonist simply accepting their entrapment, such as the grieving father realizing he is stuck in a landscape of loss. The detractors label it as anticlimactic or unnecessarily bleak. On the opposite side, we find the advocates. These are the fans of cerebral horror, who describe the channel as a masterclass in atmospheric world building. For this audience, the very things the detractors hate are the channel's greatest strengths. They do not see the deliberate pacing as a barrier, but as the clinical dread necessary to sell the premise. They appreciate that the creator trusts his listeners to navigate the collapsing reality without a guide. The consensus among the advocates is that Twilight of Horror forces you to sit with profound discomfort. In the comments, these viewers write paragraphs debating the philosophical implications of the symmetrical debt or the psychological weight of the guilty witness archetype. They frequently praise the synergy of the original soundscapes and the generated metaphysically wrong spaces, knowing how the visuals enhance the feeling of being trapped. To them, the lack of a traditional hero is a brave structural choice that reinforces the existential entrapment at the heart of every video. They don't want a happy ending. They want an honest autopsy of the human mind. This polarization is essential for the archive's metrics. It proves that the channel's narrative mechanics are functioning exactly as intended. If everyone liked Twilight of Horror, it would likely be because the dread had been diluted for mass consumption. The fact that it alienates the disaster tourist while deeply resonating with the structuralist proves that the Lovecraft metric of algorithmic illusion is holding true. The channel is not a product designed for comfort. It is a clinical observation of reality failing, and the comments section is simply the data generated by that observation. If we step out of the clinical light for a moment and speak simply as the curator of this archive, we spent the last 6 months mapping the hegemony of horror together. We've dissected the biological battlefields, the cosmic indifference, and the slow systemic deaths presented by the genre's greatest minds. But Twilight of Horror holds a specific, irreplaceable frequency in my own 2026 ledger. It remains one of my absolute favorites, not in spite of the creator's silence, but perhaps because of it. The creator's been silent for over a year. In the digital ecosystem, a year of silence is usually a death knell. The algorithm demands constant noise, constant uploads, and relentless feeding of the machine. But here, from the fan's perspective, his silence feels entirely intentional. It feels like a brilliant structural choice. Like his characters who suddenly realize their reality is a closed loop, the architect behind this channel delivered his blueprint and then performed a life-scale subtraction. He didn't need to keep producing noise to maintain his structural integrity. He built a perfect, self-sustaining trap, proved his thesis on the symmetrical debt, and stepped away into the mist. It is almost as if he became the very giant of absence he wrote about, a silent silhouette that we can still feel watching us, even though the latest transmission has long since ended. This channel is the gold standard for what we study here. It proves that you don't need a massive studio or a cheap kinetic jump scare to unmake a viewer's world. You just need airtight narrative mechanics, a microphone, and the willingness to let the dark keep its bargains. Even if the channel never updates again, the signal is still broadcasting. Once you understand the math behind his ghosts, you don't need new videos to feel the dread. You just have to look at the shadows in your own room and wonder if they are about to detach from the wall. The archive is more than just a repository. It is a community of observers who refuse to look away from the dimming. If the systemic entrapment and symmetrical debt of Twilight of Horror resonated with your frequency, I encourage you to seek out the channel for yourself. Step into his ecosystem and see if your own perspective survives the subtraction. Before we seal this file, I want to talk about how you can actually influence the ledger. When you like this video, subscribe to the archive on YouTube, TikTok, Threads, or Instagram, and explore our curated dossiers on Kindle Unlimited. It does much more than move our metrics. It changes the math for creators and authors alike, the mind behind this channel. In the digital void we all navigate, the algorithm is the gatekeeper. Your engagement acts as a signal flare, pulling these master architects out of the gray space of obscurity and placing them directly in the hands of other observers who need to see them. You are quite literally helping us map the cracks in reality by telling the machine that this kind of cerebral, structural horror matters. Until next time on the Veiled Archive.